On a sun-drenched country road in rural Pennsylvania, a seemingly ordinary farm stand is about to become the epicenter of an extraordinary confrontation. Eleanor Rigby, a 90-year-old woman with weathered hands and a steely gaze, arranges her produce with the precision of a soldier. Little do the approaching bikers know, they're about to mock a woman who once stared down Nazi officers and saved hundreds of lives behind enemy lines. This isn't just a story about an elderly woman being harassed. It's a tale of how the echoes of World War II can still resound in the most unexpected places, and how the courage that once liberated Europe can reignite to defend a small American town. As the roar of motorcycles grows louder, Eleanor stands her ground, unaware that she's about to wage one last battle, not with guns or espionage, but with the indomitable spirit that made her a hidden hero of the greatest conflict in human history. The bikers are riding into a confrontation where the true firepower lies not in their machines, but in the heart of a woman they foolishly underestimate. This is the story of how a forgotten war hero teaches a new generation about respect, valor, and the quiet strength that can topple the loudest of bullies. Eleanor Rigby's gnarled hands moved with surprising dexterity as she arranged the morning's harvest on her rickety farm stand. The vibrant red tomatoes, deep green cucumbers, and golden ears of corn stood in stark contrast to the weathered wood of the stand, much like Eleanor herself, a spark of vitality in a body worn by time. At 90 years old, Eleanor was a fixture on this quiet country road in rural Pennsylvania. Her farm stand had been operating for longer than most of the town's residents had been alive. It was more than just a place to buy fresh produce. It was a landmark, a tradition, a piece of living history. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the stand, highlighting the deep creases in Eleanor's face. Each line told a story, though few knew the true depth of those tales. To most, she was simply the old lady with the farm stand, a relic of a bygone era stubbornly clinging to her way of life. Eleanor straightened up, her back protesting with a series of pops. She squinted down the road, empty now, but soon to be busy with the usual morning traffic. Regular customers would stop by for their daily produce, exchanging pleasantries and local gossip. It was a routine as familiar to Eleanor as the changing of seasons. Little did she know this day would be different. This day would drag the past she'd long buried back into the light, forcing her to confront memories she'd locked away decades ago. As she adjusted her faded apron and settled onto her worn wooden stool, Eleanor Rigby was blissfully unaware that her quiet life was about to be turned upside down. The farm stand stood ready, its bounty on display, and Eleanor, guardian of this rural tradition, waited for the day to unfold, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. For decades, her internal clock had roused her at the same time, a habit forged in the crucible of war and tempered by years of farm life. She didn't need an alarm. Her body knew the rhythm of the earth as intimately as she knew the lines on her own hands. With practiced ease, Eleanor swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet finding her slippers without need for sight. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, a familiar symphony of an old house settling. She made her way to the kitchen, each step purposeful despite the slight tremor in her gait. The coffee pot gurgled to life, filling the air with its rich aroma. As it brewed, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, gazing out at her small farm. The fields, though not as vast as they once were, still produced enough to keep her stand stocked and her hands busy. It was more than a livelihood. It was her connection to the land, to life itself. Mug in hand, Eleanor began her morning ritual. She fed the chickens, their excited clucks a greeting she'd heard countless times. The old barn cat, Rusty, wound between her ankles, purring for his share of attention and breakfast. As the sky brightened, Eleanor made her way to the small plot where she grew her prized vegetables. Her fingers, though gnarled with arthritis, still moved with precision as she checked each plant, pinching off dead leaves and testing the soil's moisture. This wasn't just gardening. It was a form of meditation, a daily recommitment to life and growth. With a basket full of fresh picks, Eleanor headed to her farm stand. She arranged her produce with care, each tomato and ear of corn placed just so, To the casual observer, it might seem like simple fussiness, but Eleanor approached this task with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to decoding encrypted messages in a war-torn Europe. As she settled onto her stool, ready for the day's customers, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. This routine, this simple life, was hard-earned. It was a peace she'd fought for, a tranquility she'd never thought she'd live to see during those dark days of her youth. Little did Eleanor know, as she sat contentedly at her farm stand, that the echoes of her past were about to collide with her present, disrupting the careful routine she'd cultivated over decades of quiet living. The mid-morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across Eleanor's farm stand. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of ripening corn from the nearby fields, mingling with the earthy aroma of fresh tomatoes. It was a peaceful scene, one that had played out countless times over the years. Eleanor had just finished helping Mrs. Thompson, a regular customer, select the perfect cucumbers for pickling when she first heard it. A low rumble in the distance, barely discernible at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a sound out of place in this rural idyll, a mechanical growl that seemed to clash with the natural rhythm of the countryside. She cocked her head. Her hearing may not have been what it once was, but some instincts never fade. Years ago, in a different life, Eleanor had learned to distinguish the sound of approaching aircraft, friend or foe, from miles away. This sound triggered those same alert senses, though she couldn't immediately place why. As the rumble grew louder, recognition dawned. Motorcycles, not just one or two, but many, their combined engines creating a thunderous approach that now echoed through the valley. Eleanor's brow furrowed. While the occasional motorcycle wasn't uncommon on this country road, a large group was unusual. A flicker of unease passed through her, a shadow of long-buried memories. The last time she'd heard such a sound, it had been the roar of military motorcycles in occupied France. She shook her head, dispelling the thought. This was rural Pennsylvania, not war-torn Europe. There was no reason for alarm. Yet, as the sound grew ever closer, Eleanor couldn't shake a growing sense of apprehension. Her hands, which had been calmly arranging a display of bell peppers, now moved with a slight tremor. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Whatever was coming, she'd faced worse in her long life. The first glint of chrome appeared on the horizon, sunlight flashing off polished metal. The rumble had become a roar, drowning out the peaceful sounds of the countryside. Eleanor straightened her back, lifted her chin, and faced the approaching column of motorcycles with the same resolute expression she'd worn decades ago when facing down Nazi patrols. As the bikers drew nearer, their leather jackets and bandanas becoming visible, Eleanor gripped the edge of her farm stand. Something told her that her quiet routine was about to be shattered, and that this encounter would force her to confront parts of herself she'd long kept hidden. The motorcycles were almost upon her now, the peaceful country road transformed into a thundering approach. Eleanor Rigby, veteran of a war long past, prepared to face a very different kind of invasion. The tranquility of the country road shattered as the motorcycle gang roared into view. A cloud of dust billowed in their wake, momentarily obscuring Eleanor's farm stand. She squinted through the haze, her jaw set in determination, refusing to be intimidated by the cacophony of engines and the intimidating appearance of the riders. The lead biker, a burly man with a graying beard and arms covered in tattoos, raised his hand. The others behind him began to slow, their engines growling as they downshifted. Eleanor watched, her heart racing but her exterior calm, as the group of about 15 motorcycles came to a stop directly in front of her stand. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the ticking of cooling engines. The bikers surveyed the quaint farm stand and its elderly proprietor, some with amusement, others with disdain. Eleanor met their gazes steadily, her blue eyes sharp and alert despite her advanced years. The leader dismounted his bike, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the stand. He towered over Eleanor, his leather vest adorned, with patches proclaiming him as Big Mike and identifying the group as the Steel Horses MC. "Well, well," Big Mike drawled, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over motorcycle engines. "What do we have here? Granny's roadside market?" A few chuckles rippled through the group. Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but her hands, hidden behind the stand, had curled into fists. "Welcome to Rigby Farms," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Can I interest you in some fresh produce?" Big Mike leaned on the stand, his massive arms causing the old wood to creak ominously. He picked up a tomato, tossing it from hand to hand. "Ain't you a little old to be out here all alone, Granny? Don't you know there are dangerous folk on the roads these days?" More laughter from the group. A younger biker with a shaved head piped up, "Yeah, you should be in a nursing home, not out here playing farmer." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd faced down Nazi officers with less fear than she felt now, but also with less anger. These men had no idea who they were dealing with, no concept of the strength that lay beneath her weathered exterior. "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor replied, her tone laced with sarcasm that seemed to catch Big Mike off guard. "But I've been running this stand since before you were born, young man. I think I can manage." The leader's amusement faded, replaced by a glint of annoyance. He dropped the tomato back onto the stand, deliberately letting it roll off onto the ground. "Strong words for a little old lady. Maybe we ought to teach you some respect." As the bikers began to dismount their motorcycles, forming a semicircle around the stand, Eleanor felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. It had been decades since she'd felt the need to defend herself, but as she squared her shoulders and met Big Mike's intimidating glare, she knew one thing for certain: these unexpected visitors had no idea what they were getting themselves into. The tension at Eleanor's farm stand was palpable as the bikers closed in, their imposing figures casting long shadows over the weathered wood and colourful produce. Big Mike, emboldened by his gang's presence, took another step closer to Eleanor, his face twisted in a mocking sneer. "Respect?" he growled. "I'll tell you what, Granny. How about you hand over all the cash in that little tin box of yours, and we'll call it a lesson in respect. Otherwise things might get messy." Eleanor's eyes flashed with a fire that hadn't burned in years. She straightened her back, ignoring the familiar ache, and stared directly into Big Mike's eyes. When she spoke, her voice was low but carried the unmistakable tone of command. "Young man," she began, causing a ripple of laughter among the bikers, "I've faced down things far more frightening than you and your little gang. Now I suggest you turn around, get on those overpriced motorcycles of yours, and leave. This is your only warning." For a moment, Big Mike seemed taken aback by the steel in Eleanor's voice. But then, recovering his bravado, he laughed loudly. "Oh, you hear that, boys? Granny here is giving us a warning. What are you going to do? Hit us with your cane?" The gang members jeered, emboldened by their leader's mockery. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, reached across the stand and knocked over a basket of apples. The fruit rolled in the dirt as Eleanor watched, her jaw clenched tight. "I don't have a cane," Eleanor said calmly, her eyes never leaving Big Mike's. "Never needed one. But I do have this." With a speed that belied her age, Eleanor's hand disappeared beneath the stand and reappeared holding an old but well-maintained Colt .45 pistol. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the surprised intake of breath from several bikers. "Now," Eleanor continued, her grip on the pistol steady, "I may be old, but I assure you, my aim hasn't suffered for it. I've used this gun before, on men far tougher than you lot. I'd rather not use it again, but make no mistake, I will if I have to." Big Mike's face had drained of colour, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of Eleanor's unwavering resolve. He raised his hand slowly, taking a step back. "Whoa now, no need for that. We were just having a bit of fun, right, boys?" The other bikers murmured in agreement, many of them already backing toward their motorcycles. Eleanor kept the gun trained on Big Mike, her expression unflinching. "Fun," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "In my day, we had a different word for men who intimidated the elderly and destroyed their property. We called them cowards." A flicker of shame crossed Big Mike's face, quickly replaced by anger. But as he opened his mouth to retort, the sound of a police siren cut through the air. In the distance, a patrol car was approaching fast, its lights flashing. "This isn't over, old woman," Big Mike snarled as he retreated to his motorcycle. The gang quickly mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life. As they sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, Eleanor slowly lowered the pistol. Her hand trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. She looked down at the weapon, a relic from another life, and felt the weight of memories she'd long tried to forget. The confrontation was over, but as the police car pulled up, and Officer Dan Riley stepped out, his face etched with concern, Eleanor knew that the repercussions were only beginning. The quiet life she'd built for herself had been shattered, and the echoes of her past were growing louder by the minute. As Officer Dan Riley's patrol car pulled away, the dust settling on the quiet country road, Eleanor found herself alone with the aftermath of the confrontation. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins during the standoff was fading, leaving her feeling every one of her 90 years. She looked down at the Colt 45, still clutched in her hand. The weight of it, once so familiar, now felt foreign and heavy. With trembling fingers, she carefully placed it back in its hiding spot beneath the farm stand. Eleanor's eyes fell on the basket of apples, still overturned, the fruit scattered in the dirt. As she bent to pick them up, a memory flashed, unbidden. In her mind, another time, another place, where apples lay scattered amidst far worse devastation. France, 1944. The small village had been liberated just days before, but the scars of occupation were everywhere. Eleanor, then a young woman serving in the Women's Army Corps, had been assigned to assist with local relief efforts. She remembered the apple orchard on the outskirts of town, trees heavy with fruit that no one had been able to harvest. One little girl, no more than 7 or 8, had been afraid to pick the apples, convinced they were mined. Eleanor had spent hours with her, gently coaxing her into the orchard, showing her it was safe. The girl's smile when she finally bit into a fresh apple had been like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Back in the present, Eleanor realized she was cradling an apple in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't thought about that little girl in years. What was her name? Margot? Marie? The details were fading, lost to time, but the emotions remained as sharp as ever. The confrontation with the bikers had done more than just disrupt her quiet life. It had cracked open a door to her past that Eleanor had kept firmly shut for decades. Memories began to flood back. The friends she'd lost, the horrors she'd witnessed, the lives she'd saved. Each recollection was a mixed blessing, a reminder of both her strength and the high cost of war. Eleanor straightened up, wincing at the pain in her back. She looked out over her small farm, the fields she'd tended for so many years. This peaceful existence had been her refuge, her way of healing from the traumas of war. But now, with the echoes of conflict resonating once again in her life, Eleanor wondered if she had ever truly escaped her past. As she finished restoring order to her farm stand, Eleanor's resolve began to harden. The fear and uncertainty that had initially surfaced with these memories gave way to a familiar determination. She had faced down evil before, had stood strong in the face of terror and destruction. If her quiet life was to be disrupted, so be it. Eleanor Rigby had survived a world war. She could certainly handle a group of misguided bikers. With the last apple back in its basket, Eleanor sat heavily on her stool. The day's events had taken their toll, and she felt exhausted. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a small smile played across her lips. For better or worse, Eleanor realized, the fighter in her had awakened. And this time, the battle would be on her home turf. News of the confrontation at Eleanor's farm stand spread through the small town of Millbrook like wildfire. By the next morning, it seemed everyone had an opinion on the matter. The local diner, usually a place of quiet gossip and friendly chatter, had become a hotbed of debate. She shouldn't have pulled a gun on them. Martha Jennings, the town's librarian, argued over her morning coffee. It's only going to make things worse. Those bikers will be back, mark my words. And what should she have done? Let them rob her, countered Bill Thompson, a retired factory worker. Eleanor had every right to defend herself. If you ask me, she showed remarkable restraint. The town had effectively split into 2 camps. One side, primarily the older residents who had known Eleanor for years, staunchly supported her actions. They saw her as a pillar of the community, someone who had every right to protect herself and her property. The other side, mostly younger. Folks and those newer to town worried about the repercussions. They feared the bikers' return and the potential for escalating violence. Some even suggested that Eleanor should close down her farm stand, at least temporarily. Officer Dan Riley found himself caught in the middle. As he patrolled Main Street, he was stopped every few feet by concerned citizens wanting to share their thoughts. "You're going to provide protection for Ms. Rigby, aren't you?" asked Mrs. Caldwell, the third-grade teacher. "Those thugs could come back at any time." Dan tried to reassure her. "We're increasing patrols in the area, Mrs. Caldwell. But remember, Millbrook's a safe town. This was an isolated incident." Even as he said it, Dan wasn't sure he believed it. The look in Eleanor's eyes when she'd recounted the event to him had been unsettling. It wasn't fear he'd seen, but a kind of fierce determination that seemed at odds with the gentle old lady. He'd known all his life. As the day wore on, the divide in the town grew more pronounced. A group of younger residents, led by Tyler Maxwell, the owner of the new organic cafe, began circulating a petition. They wanted the town council to pass an ordinance restricting motorcycle groups from gathering in large numbers within town limits. "It's not just about Eleanor," Tyler explained to anyone who would listen. "It's about the safety of our whole community. We need to be proactive." But for every signature Tyler collected, there was someone like old Jim Parsons ready to argue the other side. "This is America," Jim would growl. "You start restricting folks' rights to ride their motorcycles where they please, where does it end? Eleanor handled those boys just fine on her own. She doesn't need the whole town turning into a nanny state on her account." As evening fell, the tension in Millbrook was palpable. The town council announced an emergency meeting for the following night to address the situation. Everyone had an opinion, but no one seemed to be asking the one person at the center of it all what she thought. Eleanor Rigby, oblivious to the storm brewing in town, tended to her vegetables and prepared for another day at her farm stand. She had faced down the bikers, but the real challenge lay ahead, confronting a town that was tearing itself apart over her actions and facing the long-buried memories that the incident had dredged up. Little did the townsfolk know, their perception of Eleanor, and indeed Eleanor's perception of herself, was about to change dramatically. As the town of Millbrook argued about her fate, Eleanor Rigby sat in her small farmhouse, a dusty photo album open on her lap. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed, but the memories contained within were as vivid as ever. Eleanor's gnarled fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages, each photograph a window into a past she had long kept hidden. There she was, a young woman in uniform, her face serious but her eyes bright with determination. The Women's Army Corps insignia shone on her collar, a testament to her service. But it wasn't her official military photos that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. It was the candid shots, the moments captured between missions that made her heart ache with remembrance. There was Marie, her best friend and fellow WAC, laughing as they shared a rare chocolate bar, and Thomas, the young medic who had stolen her heart, only to lose his life on the beaches of Normandy. Eleanor paused at a particular photo, one she had almost forgotten. It showed her standing next to a distinguished-looking man in a British uniform. The caption, written in her own youthful hand, read, "With Captain Williams, after successful mission, Lyon, 1944. The memories came flooding back. Captain Williams had been her handler in the French resistance. Eleanor hadn't just been a regular WAC. She had been recruited for special operations due to her exceptional skills in radio communications and her fluency in French. For months, she had worked behind enemy lines, coordinating with the French resistance, relaying crucial information back to the Allies. The risks had been enormous. Discovery would have meant certain death, not just for her, but for the entire network of resistance fighters she worked with. Eleanor remembered the constant fear, the nights spent huddled over a radio in damp cellars, the heart-stopping moments when Nazi patrols passed too close for comfort. But she also remembered the triumphs, the successful sabotage operations, the downed pilots safely evacuated, the lives saved through timely intelligence. One memory stood out starkly. A mission had gone wrong, their safe house compromised. Eleanor had found herself face to face with a Nazi officer, her cover on the verge of being blown. In that moment, she had made a split-second decision that saved her entire team, but had haunted her ever since. Eleanor closed the album, her hands shaking not just from age now, but from the weight of her memories. She had never spoken of her real role in the war, not to anyone in Millbrook. After the war, she had sought peace and anonymity, wanting nothing more than to leave the violence and fear behind. But now, with the threat of the bikers looming and her quiet life disrupted, Eleanor felt the old instincts awakening. The skills she had honed in war, the courage she had found in the face of true evil, they were still a part of her, buried deep but not forgotten. As the sun set outside her window, Eleanor Rigby made a decision. For decades, she had been just the old lady with the farm stand. Perhaps it was time for Millbrook and the world to know the truth about who she really was and what she was capable of. Eleanor stood, her joints protesting but her spine straight. She had faced down the Nazi war machine. She could certainly handle a gang of miscreant bikers. It was time to step out of the shadows of her past and into the light of the present. With renewed purpose, Eleanor began to plan. The town meeting. Tomorrow would be her stage, and she would make sure her voice was heard. The battle for Millbrook was just beginning, and this time Eleanor wouldn't be fighting from the shadows. The day of the town meeting dawned clear and warm, but there was a tension in the air that belied the pleasant weather. Eleanor had just finished setting up her farm stand, determined to maintain her routine despite the turmoil of the past few days, when she heard it. The now familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance. This time, Eleanor didn't feel fear. Instead, a calm determination settled over her, reminiscent of the focused state she used to enter before a dangerous mission in her WAC days. She straightened, her apron, patted her hair, and waited. The motorcycle gang, led by Big Mike, roared into view. But this time, instead of stopping at Eleanor's stand, they continued past, heading straight into town. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she watched them disappear around the bend. This wasn't about her anymore. The entire town of Millbrook was now involved. In town, the arrival of the bikers caused an immediate stir. Shopkeepers hurriedly locked their doors, parents ushered children inside, and the lone police car on patrol swung into action, lights flashing as Officer Dan Riley pulled up alongside the gang. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Dan said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "What brings you back to Millbrook?" Big Mike, his massive frame dwarfing his motorcycle, grinned down at the officer. "Just enjoying a ride through your lovely town, officer. That's not against the law, is it?" Before Dan could respond, Tyler Maxwell from the Organic Cafe stormed out onto the street. "You're not welcome here," he shouted, his face red with anger. "Leave our town alone!" The situation was escalating quickly. More townspeople were emerging. From shops and homes, a mix of fear and anger on their faces. The bikers, for their part, seemed to be relishing the chaos they were causing. Just as it seemed things might turn violent, a clear, strong voice cut through the commotion. "That's quite enough." All heads turned to see Eleanor Rigby striding down the street, her back straight and her eyes blazing with a fire that made her look decades younger. She walked directly up to Big Mike, seemingly oblivious to the danger. "You and I," she said, pointing a finger at his massive chest, "need to have a talk now." The crowd fell silent, shocked by Eleanor's boldness. Even Big Mike seemed taken aback. For a moment, no one moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, Big Mike laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but one of genuine amusement, and perhaps a hint of respect. "Well, well," he rumbled. "The old lady's got spirit. All right, Grandma, let's talk." Eleanor nodded curtly. "Not here. There's a diner down the street. We'll talk there." She turned to address the gathered townspeople. "The rest of you, go about your business. This doesn't concern you." As Eleanor led Big Mike towards the diner, his gang following behind, the town watched in stunned silence. Officer Dan made to follow, but Eleanor waved him off with a look that brooked no argument. Inside the diner, Eleanor seated herself at a booth, gesturing for Big Mike to join her. The rest of the gang crowded around nearby tables, while the regular patrons huddled at the far end of the diner, watching nervously. "Now then," Eleanor said, her voice calm but steely. "Let's discuss why you're really here, and what it's going to take for you to leave Millbrook alone." As the unlikely pair began their conversation, the town held its collective breath. The outcome of this meeting would determine the fate of Millbrook, and no one, not even Eleanor herself, could predict what would happen next. The diner fell, silent as Eleanor and Big Mike faced each other across the worn Formica table. The biker gang leader's massive frame seemed to fill the entire booth, but it was Eleanor's presence that commanded the room's attention. "Let's cut to the chase," Eleanor began, her voice low but clear. "You're not here for the scenery or the fresh produce. What do you want with Millbrook?" Big Mike leaned back, his leather jacket creaking. "You've got spirit, old lady. I'll give you that. But this isn't about what we want. It's about what's ours." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "This town," Big Mike said, gesturing broadly, "sits on land that once belonged to my grandfather. He was forced to sell it for a pittance during the Depression. We're here to reclaim what's rightfully ours." A murmur ran through the diner. This was news to everyone, including Eleanor, but she didn't let her surprise show on her face. "That was a long time ago," she said carefully. "Things change. People build lives here." Big Mike leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl. "Maybe so, but blood and land, that doesn't change." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her mind racing. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out an old, folded piece of paper. "I think you need to see this," she said, smoothing it out on the table. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local Hero Saves Town from Bankruptcy." The article detailed how a returning World War II veteran had used his combat pay to help the town pay off its debts and avoid being sold off to developers. "That veteran," Eleanor said softly, "was my late husband, James Rigby. He didn't just save random land. He saved homes, lives, an entire community." Big Mike stared at the clipping, his brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that history is complicated," Eleanor replied. "Your grandfather may have lost this land, and that's a tragedy, but other people sacrificed to keep it alive. My husband gave everything he had. I've spent my entire life tending this land, not as a possession, but as a responsibility." The diner was dead silent now, everyone straining to hear the conversation. Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "You talk about blood and land. Well, let me tell you something about blood." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a faded tattoo, a series of numbers. "I didn't just marry a war hero. I served, too, in places where I saw what happens when people decide they have the right to take whatever they want, regardless of who it hurts." Big Mike's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of the tattoo. "You were a prisoner," Eleanor finished. "For him, yes, briefly, but more than that, I was a soldier. I fought against people who thought their history, their blood, gave them the right to destroy and take. And let me tell you, young man, they were a lot scarier than you and your gang." The atmosphere in the diner had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a mix of awe and dawning understanding. Eleanor Rigby wasn't just some old lady who ran a farm stand. She was a living piece of history, a hero in her own right. Big Mike was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its menacing edge. I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Eleanor said firmly. "You came here seeing only what you wanted to see. An easy target, a town to bully. But Millbrook is more than that. These people, this land, they're worth fighting for, and believe me, we will fight if we have to." The implications of her words hung in the air. Big Mike looked around the diner, seeing the determined faces of the townspeople for the first time. He looked uncertain. Eleanor stood up, her small frame somehow towering over the seated biker. "So, Mr. Mike, the question isn't what you want from Millbrook. The question is, are you prepared for what will happen if you try to take it? As Big Mike struggled to find a response, the town of Millbrook held its breath, waiting to see how this unexpected history lesson would change their future. The tension in the diner was palpable as everyone waited for Big Mike's response. The biker leader's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Surprise, respect, and lingering anger warred for dominance. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier menace. "You've given me something to think about, Mrs. Rigby, but this isn't over. We need time to reassess our position." Eleanor nodded, her posture relaxing slightly but her eyes remaining sharp. "Take all the time you need. But remember, Millbrook isn't just a plot of land. It's a community, and we stand together." As Big Mike stood to leave, the diner's door burst open. Tyler Maxwell stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "What's going on here? Why are we negotiating with these thugs?" The sudden interruption shattered the delicate peace that had been forming. Big Mike's gang members, already on edge, stood up, hands moving towards concealed weapons. "Tyler, stand down!" Eleanor commanded, but the young man was too worked up to listen. "No, we shouldn't be talking to them. We should be running them out of town," Tyler shouted, advancing towards Big Mike. What happened next occurred so quickly that later witnesses would disagree on the exact sequence of events. Tyler lunged forward, either to push Big Mike or strike him. The biker leader, reacting on instinct, raised his arm to defend himself. In the confusion, a cup of hot coffee was knocked over, scalding Tyler's arm. The young man's cry of pain was the spark that ignited the powder keg. In an instant, the diner erupted into chaos. Bikers and townspeople collided in a flurry of shoves and wild swings. The sound of breaking dishes and overturning furniture filled the air. Eleanor's voice cut through the mayhem like a whip crack. "Enough!" To everyone's surprise, it was Big Mike who responded first, grabbing two of his men and pulling them back. "Stand down!" he roared to his gang. Eleanor, meanwhile, had placed herself between Tyler and the bikers, her small frame somehow acting as an effective barrier. "This stops now," she said, her voice low but carrying an unmistakable note of command. Officer Dan Riley, who had been watching from outside, chose that moment to enter, his hand on his holster. "Everything all right in here?" The fight seemed to drain out of both sides as quickly as it had erupted. Big Mike, his earlier bravado gone, looked almost sheepish. "Just a misunderstanding, officer. We were just leaving." As the bikers filed out, Eleanor turned to the shaken townspeople. "Is anyone hurt? Tyler, let me see that arm." While Eleanor tended to Tyler's scalded arm with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to handling injuries, the rest of the diner's occupants began to put the place back in order. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rigby," Tyler said, wincing as she applied a cool, damp cloth to his arm. "I just couldn't stand the idea of them pushing us around." Eleanor's face softened. "I understand, Tyler, but battles aren't always won with fists. Sometimes the strongest weapon is right here." She tapped her temple. As the adrenaline of the moment faded, the full impact of what had transpired began to sink in. The tenuous truce Eleanor had been building with Big Mike was now in jeopardy. The town's fear of the bikers had been reignited, and Eleanor's own carefully guarded past was now out in the open. Looking around at the shaken faces of her neighbors, Eleanor realized that the real challenge was just beginning. She had faced down the bikers, but now she needed to rally her community. As she helped right an overturned table, Eleanor began to formulate a plan. The battle for Millbrook's future was far from over, and Eleanor Rigby, World War II veteran and unassuming hero, was preparing for one last fight. The day after the diner incident, Eleanor was at her farm stand earlier than usual. She hadn't slept well, her mind racing with memories of the past and worries about the future. As she arranged her produce, she heard the now familiar sound of a motorcycle approaching. Tensing slightly, Eleanor looked up, half expecting to see Big Mike or one of his gang members. Instead, she was surprised to see a solitary rider on a sleek, well-maintained bike. The stranger pulled up to the stand and killed the engine. As the rider removed their helmet, Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise. The woman who stepped off the bike was in her 60s, with salt and pepper hair, cut short and practical. She wore riding leathers that had clearly seen many miles. "Eleanor Rigby?" the woman asked, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Thompson. I believe we need to talk." Eleanor shook the offered hand, her curiosity piqued. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah's lips quirked in a half-smile. "It's Ms., actually, and it's more about what I can do for you. I heard about what happened yesterday. Word travels fast in biker circles." Eleanor's guard went up immediately. "Are you with Big Mike's gang?" "Good Lord, no," Sarah laughed. "I run a different kind of motorcycle club. We're called the Silver Eagles. We're all veterans, mostly Vietnam era, but we've got members from Korea to Afghanistan." Eleanor relaxed slightly, but remained cautious. "And you're here because—" Sarah's expression turned serious. "Because when I heard about a World War II vet standing up to a bunch of hooligans, I knew I had to come see for myself." "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Eleanor. Big Mike's crew isn't used to being challenged, especially not by a small town." "We can handle ourselves," Eleanor said firmly. "I don't doubt it," Sarah nodded. "But you shouldn't have to handle it alone. My club, we protect people, especially fellow vets. We'd like to help." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying Sarah's face. She saw sincerity there, and something else, a familiar look of determination she recognized from her own mirror. "Why?" Eleanor asked simply. Sarah sighed, her eyes distant for a moment. "Because when I came back from Nam, nobody stood up for us. We were treated like criminals in our own country. I swore I'd never let that happen to another vet if I could." "Help it?" Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding all too well. "And your club? They're willing to get involved in our little town's problems?" "Eleanor," Sarah said with a grin, "half my club is itching for a good cause to fight for. The other half just loves the idea of teaching young punks like Big Mike a lesson in respect." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her lips. "It's tempting, I'll admit, but I don't want any violence in Millbrook. We've had enough of that." "Who said anything about violence?" Sarah's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to show up with enough friends that the other side doesn't dare throw a punch." Eleanor considered this. Having the support of another motorcycle club, especially one made up of veterans, could change the entire dynamic with Big Mike's gang, but it could also escalate the situation in ways she couldn't predict. "I appreciate the offer, Sarah," Eleanor said finally, "but I need to think about it. This isn't just my decision to make. The whole town is involved now." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Fair enough. We'll be around if you need us. In the meantime, how about selling me some of those delicious-looking tomatoes? I've got a long ride ahead of me." As Eleanor bagged up the tomatoes, she felt a glimmer of hope. She might have found not just an ally, but a kindred spirit. The challenge now would be convincing the town to accept this unexpected offer of help. Watching Sarah ride away, Eleanor straightened her shoulders. It was time to call a town meeting. The people of Millbrook needed to understand what they were really facing and what it might take to save their home. The Millbrook Community Center was packed to capacity. It seemed every resident of the small town had turned out for this emergency meeting. The air was thick with tension and the low murmur of worried conversations. Eleanor Rigby stood at the front of the room, her small frame somehow commanding the space. Beside her, Mayor Johnson fidgeted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Officer Dan Riley stood near the door, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. "Folks, please settle down," Mayor Johnson called out, his voice barely carrying over the noise. When the chatter continued unabated, Eleanor stepped forward. "Quiet!" Her voice, honed by years of command, cut through the din like a knife. The room fell silent instantly. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her tones softening. "I know you're all worried. You have every right to be, but panic and fear won't solve anything. We need to face this situation head-on, as a community." She proceeded to recount the events of the past few days, her confrontation with the bikers, the revelation about Big Mike's claim to the land, and the incident at the diner. As she spoke, she could see the mix of emotions on her neighbors' faces. Fear, anger, confusion, and underneath it all, a growing resolve. "Now," Eleanor continued. We have a decision to make. We can either let fear drive us, or we can stand together and fight for our home. Tyler Maxwell, his arm still bandaged from the coffee burn, stood up. Fight how? These guys are dangerous. We should be calling in the state police, the FBI, anyone who can help. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eleanor held up her hand for silence. I understand the temptation, Tyler. But escalating this to outside law enforcement, or it could make things worse. We don't want Millbrook turning into a battleground. So what do you suggest? This from Martha Jennings, the librarian. We can't just sit back and do nothing. Eleanor took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. I've been approached by another motorcycle club. They're called the Silver Eagles, and they're all veterans. They've offered to help us. The room erupted into chaos. More bikers. Are you crazy? How do we know we can trust them? Mayor Johnson looked like he was about to faint. Officer Riley stepped forward, his hand raised for quiet. Folks, please, he said. Let's hear Eleanor. Out. She's earned our trust, hasn't she? As the room quieted, Eleanor continued, I know it sounds crazy, but these aren't like Big Mike's gang. The Silver Eagles are veterans like me. They understand honor, duty, and the importance of community. She went on to explain Sarah Thompson's visit and the offer of help. As she spoke, she could see the skepticism on many faces slowly giving way to consideration. I'm not saying we should just accept their offer blindly, Eleanor said, but I think we should consider it. Sometimes the best way to prevent a fight is to show your opponent that you're not an easy target. Bill Thompson, the retired factory worker, stood up. I don't like the idea of bringing in outsiders, but I trust Eleanor. If she thinks these Silver Eagles can help, I say we give them a chance. A murmur of agreement spread through the room, but Tyler wasn't convinced. This is insane, he protested. We're talking about fighting fire with fire. What if it just makes everything worse? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Tyler, I've seen war up close. Believe me, I don't want to bring any kind of violence to Millbrook. But sometimes standing up for what's right means being willing to fight if we have to. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Mayor Johnson, seeing a chance to regain control of the meeting, stepped forward. I propose we put it to a vote, he said. All in favor of accepting the Silver Eagles' help, raise your hand. Slowly, hands began to rise. First a few, then more, until nearly 2/3 of the room had their hands up. It's decided then, the mayor announced, relief evident in his voice. Eleanor, please contact the Silver Eagles and accept their offer. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had convinced the town to take a risky step. Now she had to make sure it was the right one. Outside the community center, Eleanor found Officer Riley waiting for her. You sure about this, Eleanor? He asked, concern evident in his voice. Eleanor nodded, her expression resolute. No, Dan, I'm not sure about anything. But I do know one thing: Millbrook is worth fighting for. And sometimes the best way to prevent a war is to show you're ready for one. As she walked home in the fading light, Eleanor Rigby, former WAC war hero and now unlikely leader of a town in crisis, began to plan her next move. The real battle for Millbrook was just beginning. The night after the town meeting, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. The weight of the town's expectations pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew that bringing in the Silver Eagles was a gamble, one that could backfire spectacularly if not handled correctly. As she mulled over her options, her eyes fell on an old photograph hanging on the wall. It showed her and James on their wedding day, both still in uniform. She remembered how young and invincible they had felt, fresh from the war and ready to take on the world. "What would you do, James?" she whispered to the empty room. As if in answer, a memory surfaced. It was from their early days in Millbrook, when the town was struggling, and some of the locals were resentful of the outsiders who had bought up the old Henderson place. James had faced down angry neighbors with the same calm determination he'd shown on the battlefield. "You can't control how others act, Ellie," he had told her. "You can only control how you respond. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to extend a hand in friendship, even when you're expecting a fist. Eleanor's eyes widened as an idea began to form. She had been thinking of this situation as a potential battle, falling back on her military training. But what if there was another way? She grabbed her phone and dialed Sarah Thompson's number. "Sarah, it's Eleanor Rigby. I need your help, but not in the way you might think." As Eleanor outlined her plan, she could hear the surprise and then growing enthusiasm in Sarah's voice. "It's risky," Sarah said when Eleanor finished, "but I like it. Count us in." After hanging up, Eleanor made another call, this one much harder. She had to steel herself before dialing. "Big Mike, this is Eleanor Rigby. We need to talk." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Eleanor was at her farm stand early, but she wasn't alone. Sarah Thompson and a dozen members of the Silver Eagles were with her, helping to set up what looked like a massive barbecue. As the townspeople began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual activity and the smell of cooking food, they were greeted by the surprising sight of leather-clad bikers flipping burgers and setting up tables. Eleanor stood by the entrance to her property, greeting her neighbors and trying to calm their obvious nervousness. "It's all right," she assured them. "They're here to help. Please, join us for breakfast." Slowly, cautiously, the people of Millbrook began to gather. The Silver Eagles, true to Sarah's word, were the picture of politeness, serving food and engaging in friendly conversation. Just as the impromptu party was in full swing, the rumble of motorcycles announced the arrival of Big Mike and his gang. The townspeople tensed, some reaching for their children. But Eleanor stepped forward, calm and composed. "Mike," she called out, "right on time. Come join us. There's plenty of food." The biker leader looked bewildered, his eyes darting between Eleanor, the Silver Eagles, and the townspeople. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn and leave, but then, to everyone's surprise, he cut his engine and dismounted. "What's all this?" he asked gruffly as he approached Eleanor. "This," Eleanor said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is a chance for us all to talk. No threats, no violence. Just people sharing a meal and trying to understand each other." As Big Mike's gang hesitantly joined the gathering, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. It was a gamble, yes. But as she watched Sarah Thompson strike up a conversation with one of Big Mike's lieutenants over a plate of bacon, she felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end of their troubles, not by a long shot, but it was a start. And as Eleanor had learned long ago, sometimes the first step towards peace was simply sitting down at the same table. The battle for Millbrook's future was far from over, but for now, at least, the weapons were words and the ammunition was understanding. And that, Eleanor thought, was a fight she knew how to win. The days following the impromptu barbecue were filled with a strange mix of tension and hope. While Eleanor's bold move had succeeded in opening a dialogue between the town, the Silver Eagles, and Big Mike's gang, it was clear that the underlying issues were far from resolved. Eleanor found herself at the center of it all, mediating discussions and trying to keep the fragile peace intact. It was exhausting work, reminding her of the delicate negotiations she'd been part of during the war. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch, taking a much-needed break, Sarah Thompson pulled up on her motorcycle. "How are you holding up, Eleanor?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair next to her. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've been better, but I've been worse too." Sarah nodded understandingly. "You know what you're doing here? It's impressive, but you can't do it all alone." "I'm not alone," Eleanor protested. "The whole town is involved now." "That's not what I mean," Sarah said gently. "You're carrying the weight of this entire situation on your shoulders. It's not sustainable." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering Sarah's words. "What do you suggest?" "Let us help more," Sarah said, "not just as a show of force, but with the negotiations. Many of our members have experience with conflict resolution from their time in the service." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That could be useful. But we need to be careful. If Big Mike thinks we're ganging up on him, it could undo all the progress we've made." "Marta." As they discussed strategies, Officer Dan Riley's patrol car pulled up. The look on his face told Eleanor that something was wrong before he even spoke. "Eleanor," "We've got a problem," Dan said as he approached the porch. Some of Big Mike's guys were spotted snooping around the old records office at the county seat. They're digging into the land claims. Eleanor's heart sank. She had hoped that the barbecue and subsequent talks had bought them more time. But it seemed Big Mike wasn't willing to let go of his claims so easily. "That's not all," Dan continued. "There's word that they've hired a lawyer, a big shot from the city who specializes in land disputes." Sarah whistled low. "They're preparing for a legal battle." Eleanor stood up, her jaw set with determination. "Then so must we. Dan, I need you to gather any records we have about the town's history, especially from the Depression era. Sarah, can your people do some digging too? We need to know exactly what we're up against." Both nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. "I'll reach out to some contacts in veterans legal aid," Sarah added. "We might be able to get some pro bono help." As Dan and Sarah left to carry out their tasks, Eleanor went inside and pulled out the old box of James's papers she kept in the attic. If there was any evidence to support their claim to the land, it might be in there. Hours passed as Eleanor pored over faded documents and old photographs. Her eyes were strained and her back ached, but she pressed on. Finally, as the sun was setting, she found something. It was a letter dated 1947 from the mayor at the time. It thanked James for his generous contribution to the town's welfare and mentioned a legal arrangement ensuring the preservation of Millbrook's integrity. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the letter. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a start. It proved that James's involvement in saving the town went beyond just financial help. As she carefully placed the letter back in its envelope, Eleanor realized that the conflict she had been trying to avoid might be inevitable. But now, at least, they had something to fight with. She picked up the phone to call Dan and Sarah. The real preparations were about to begin. Millbrook needed to be ready, not just for a show of force, but for a battle in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. As she dialed, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of resolve settling over her. This was no longer just about protecting her farm or her town. It was about preserving a legacy, James's legacy, and the legacy of everyone who had worked to make Millbrook what it was. The challenge ahead was daunting, but Eleanor Rigby had never been one to back down from a fight, especially not one this important. The Millbrook town square had never seen a day quite like this. On one side stood Big Mike and his gang, their motorcycles gleaming in the morning sun. With them was a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, their lawyer, Eleanor presumed. On the other side were the townspeople, a sea of familiar faces, all wearing expressions of determination and worry. Eleanor stood at the forefront of the Millbrook group, flanked by Sarah Thompson and several members of the Silver Eagles. The contrast between the two biker groups couldn't have been starker. Where Big Mike's gang exuded menace, the Silver Eagles stood tall and dignified, their presence a calming influence on the nervous townspeople. Mayor Johnson, looking distinctly uncomfortable, stepped into the space between the two groups. "Folks," he began, his voice quavering slightly, "we're here to discuss the, land claim issue that's been raised. I hope we can keep this civil and—" "Save it," Big Mike interrupted, stepping forward. "We're not here to chat. We're here to claim what's rightfully ours." He nodded to his lawyer, who pulled out a stack of documents from his briefcase. Eleanor felt a ripple of fear go through the crowd behind her. This was the moment they'd been dreading. But as she opened her mouth to speak, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "Now hold on just a minute!" The crowd parted to reveal old Jim Parsons, Millbrook's oldest resident at 95, making his way forward with the help of his walking stick. Eleanor felt a surge of affection for the cantankerous old man. Jim hobbled up to stand beside Eleanor, his roomy eyes fixed on Big Mike. "You claim this land is rightfully yours? Boy, I was here when your grandfather lost this land, and let me tell you, there's nothing rightful about it." The lawyer stepped forward, a condescending smile on his face. "With all due respect, sir, the legal documents clearly show—" "Legal documents," Jim scoffed. "I'll tell you what those documents don't show. They don't show how your client's grandfather was a no-good bootlegger who gambled away his land. They don't show how he threatened half the town when they wouldn't buy his rot-gut whiskey. A murmur ran through both crowds. Big Mike's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You're lying, old man," he growled. "Am I?" Jim challenged. He turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Rigby, I believe you have something to add here?" Eleanor nodded, pulling out the letter she had found. "This is a letter from the mayor in 1947 thanking my late husband James for his role in preserving Millbrook. It mentions a legal arrangement that ensured the town's integrity." The lawyer frowned, reaching for the letter, but Eleanor held it back. "This letter, along with the town's records and the testimonies of our oldest residents, paint a very different picture than the one you're trying to sell." Sarah Thompson stepped forward. "We've had our legal team look into this. The land transfer was legal and binding. More than that, it was necessary to save this town from the chaos your grandfather left in his wake." Big Mike looked uncertainly at his lawyer, who was furiously flipping through his documents. Eleanor seized the moment. "Mike, I know you believe you're fighting for your family's legacy, but Millbrook is our legacy, all of ours. The people here have poured their lives into this land. We've nurtured it, protected it, made it thrive. That's worth more than any paper claim." For a long moment, silence reigned in the town square. Everyone waited to see how Big Mike would respond. The biker leader looked around, taking in the determined faces of the townspeople, the steady gazes of the Silver Eagles, and finally, the unwavering eyes of Eleanor Rigby. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. "I need to think about this," he said gruffly. "This isn't over, but we'll back off for now." As Big Mike and his gang roared out of the town square, the citizens of Millbrook let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The standoff had ended, not with violence, but with words and the weight of history. Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Sarah smiling at her. "Well done, soldier," the Silver Eagle said softly. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this skirmish. More importantly, they had done it together, as a community. Old Jim Parsons winked at her as he hobbled past. "Not bad for a bunch of youngsters," he cackled. Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. There would be more challenges ahead, she knew, but for now, Millbrook stood united. And that, she thought, was a victory worth celebrating. In the days following the standoff in the town square, Millbrook buzzed with a new energy. The united front displayed by the townspeople had not only pushed back Big Mike's claim, but had also awakened a sense of community pride that had been dormant for years. Eleanor found herself at the center of this renewed spirit. People she had known for decades were looking at her with new eyes, finally seeing beyond the quiet old lady who ran the farm stand. Children asked for stories about her war experiences, and even the town's teenagers, usually more interested in their phones than local history, were paying attention. One sunny afternoon, as Eleanor was tending to her tomatoes, she heard the now familiar rumble of a motorcycle. Looking up, she saw Sarah Thompson pulling up to her stand. "Thought I'd stop by and see how our local hero is doing," Sarah said. With a grin as she dismounted, Eleanor snorted. "Hero? Hardly. I'm just an old woman who's lived long enough to have some useful stories." Sarah's expression turned serious. "Don't sell yourself short, Eleanor. What you did, standing up to those bikers, rallying the town, uncovering the truth about the land, that's real heroism. It's the same spirit that made you a hero in the war." Eleanor was about to protest when she noticed Sarah wasn't alone. A small group of people had gathered near the farm stand, looking nervous but determined. "What's all this?" Eleanor asked, eyeing the group curiously. Sarah smiled. "These folks have something they want to say to you." Tyler Maxwell stepped forward first, his face a mix of embarrassment and admiration. "Mrs. Rigby, I wanted to apologize. I was wrong about you, wrong about how to handle the situation with the bikers. You showed us what real courage looks like." Before Eleanor could respond, Martha Jennings, the librarian, spoke up. "We've been doing some research, Eleanor, about your service during the war. Why didn't you ever tell us? The things you did. You're a genuine war hero." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. That was a long time ago. It didn't seem important to bring up. "But it is important," Officer Dan Riley interjected. Your experiences, your courage, they're part of what makes Millbrook special. We should have recognized it sooner. One by one, the townspeople stepped forward, offering words of gratitude and admiration. Eleanor felt overwhelmed, unsure how to respond to this outpouring of appreciation. Finally, Mayor Johnson cleared his throat. Eleanor, in light of recent events and, well, long overdue recognition, we'd like to do something special. We want to dedicate the town square in your honor. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. Oh no, that's not necessary. But Sarah cut her off gently. It is necessary, Eleanor, not just for you, but for Millbrook. Your story, your legacy, it's a reminder of what this town stands for, of what we can achieve when we stand together. As Eleanor looked at the faces around her, friends and neighbors she'd known for years, now seeing her in a new light, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in her past accomplishments, yes, but also a deep sense of connection to this community that had been her home for so long. I don't know what to say, Eleanor finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Sarah replied softly. Just know that you're valued, respected, and very much needed in this town. As the impromptu gathering turned into a celebration, with people sharing stories and laughter around Eleanor's farm stand, she found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. From a young whack in war-torn Europe to a simple farmer, and now, somehow, back to being recognized as a hero. But looking at the joy and unity on the faces around her, Eleanor realized that perhaps her greatest accomplishment wasn't in her past at all. It was here, in Millbrook, in the community she had helped to build and now had helped to save. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the farm and the gathered townspeople, Eleanor Rigby allowed herself to feel for the first time in many years, truly seen and appreciated for all that she was. Farmer, veteran, hero, and above all, a beloved member of the Millbrook community. The day of the town square dedication dawned bright and clear. It seemed all of Millbrook had turned out for the occasion, the square packed with familiar faces and a festive atmosphere. Colourful banners hung from lampposts, and a small stage had been set up in front of the old courthouse. Eleanor sat in a place of honour on the stage, feeling somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention. Sarah Thompson and several of the Silver Eagles stood nearby, their presence a comforting reminder of the unlikely alliance that had helped save the town. As Mayor Johnson stepped up to the microphone to begin the ceremony, a murmur ran through the crowd. Heads turned to see a group of motorcycles approaching. For a moment, tension rippled through the gathering, but it quickly dissipated as people recognized Big Mike and his gang. The bikers parked at the edge of the square and dismounted. Big Mike, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a clean shirt and jeans, made his way through the crowd. To everyone's surprise, he was carrying a large wrapped package. Mayor Johnson, recovering quickly from the unexpected arrival, cleared his throat. Welcome everyone to this special day for Millbrook. We're here to honor one of our own, a woman whose bravery and dedication have recently come to light, though they've been benefiting our town for decades. As the mayor continued his speech, detailing Eleanor's wartime service and her recent role in uniting the town against external threats, Eleanor found her attention drawn to Big Mike. The biker leader stood at the back of the crowd, shifting, his weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of his place in this gathering. When the mayor finished his speech and the new plaque naming the square after Eleanor was unveiled, there was a round of applause. Then, to everyone's surprise, Big Mike stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said gruffly into the sudden silence. "I've got something I'd like to say." Mayor Johnson, looking uncertain, gestured for Big Mike to approach the stage. The biker leader climbed the steps, standing awkwardly before the microphone. "Mrs. Rigby," he began, his voice surprisingly soft, we came here thinking we knew the truth, thought we were reclaiming something that was ours. But we were wrong." He unwrapped the package he'd been carrying, revealing an old framed photograph. "This is my grandfather," he said, holding it up for Eleanor to see. "The man who lost this land. I always thought he was a victim, but, well, after what that old-timer said, I did some digging of my own. Big Mike's voice grew stronger as he continued. Turns out the stories about him weren't lies. He wasn't a good man. And what happened here, with your husband saving the town, that was real, that mattered. He turned to address the crowd. We came here looking for a fight, looking to take something. But this town, you people, you showed us what community really means. You stood together. You stood strong. Big Mike faced Eleanor again. Mrs. Rigby, I want to apologize. To you, and to all of Millbrook. We were wrong, and, well, I hope maybe we can make amends somehow. The square was silent as everyone waited for Eleanor's response. Slowly, she stood and approached Big Mike. Despite the difference in their size, it was the biker leader who seemed small in that moment. Michael, Eleanor said, using his proper name for the first time, thank you. Your words mean a great deal. To err is human, but to admit our mistakes and seek to make amends, that's what really defines us. She turned to address the gathered townspeople. Millbrook has always been a place of second chances, a place where people can come to start over, to build something new. That's what my James believed in, and it's what I believe in too. Eleanor held out her hand to Big Mike. So, if you're willing, I think Millbrook might have room for a few more residents, ones who've learned the value of community and are ready to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Big Mike's eyes widened in surprise. Slowly, almost reverently, he took Eleanor's hand. The applause started softly, then built to a roar as the people of Millbrook witnessed this unexpected act of reconciliation. As Eleanor looked out over the crowd, the familiar faces of her neighbors, the silver eagles standing tall and proud, and now Big Mike and his gang looking shell-shocked but grateful, she felt a profound sense of rightness. This, she thought, was what she had fought for all those years ago, not just for victory over an enemy, but for the chance to build something beautiful, a community where people could come together, overcome their differences, and create a home for all. In that moment, as the sun shone down on the newly christened Eleanor Rigby Square, the town of Millbrook felt truly united, and Eleanor, the unlikely hero at the center of it all, knew that her greatest legacy was not in her past, but in the bright future that lay ahead for the town she loved. In the weeks following the dedication ceremony, Millbrook underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The tension that had gripped the town during the conflict with Big Mike's gang gradually gave way to a renewed sense of community spirit. Eleanor found herself busier than ever. Her farm stand became a hub of activity, with people stopping by, not just for fresh produce, but for conversation, advice, and stories of her wartime experiences. She discovered that sharing these long-buried memories was unexpectedly cathartic. One sunny afternoon, as Eleanor was closing up the stand, she was surprised to see Big Mike pull up on his motorcycle. He dismounted awkwardly, looking out of place without his usual entourage. "Mrs. Rigby," he said, nodding respectfully. "Got a minute?" Eleanor gestured to a nearby bench. "Of course. What's on your mind, Michael?" As they sat, Big Mike seemed to struggle with his words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About second chances and being part of something bigger." Eleanor waited patiently, sensing there was more. "Thing is," he continued, "my boys and we don't really know how to do that. Be part of a community, I mean. We've always been outsiders." Eleanor considered this for a moment. "Well, Michael, being part of a community isn't something you're born knowing. It's something you learn day by day." She gestured towards the town. "See that playground? It needs repainting. And old Mrs. Johnson's roof has been leaking for months. These are the kinds of things neighbors help with." Big Mike's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean we could help with stuff like that?" Eleanor nodded. "Start small. Offer to help. Show up when there's work to be done. That's how you build trust, how you become part of something." As they continued to talk, Eleanor saw a glimmer of the man Big Mike could be, not a menacing biker, but a strong, capable leader looking for purpose. Over the next few weeks, Millbrook witnessed a surprising sight: Big Mike and his gang working alongside townspeople to repair, clean, and improve various parts of the town. At first, people were wary, but as the bikers proved their sincerity, through hard work and respectful behavior, the barriers began to break down. Eleanor watched this transformation with a sense of pride and hope. She saw how Sarah and the Silver Eagles played a crucial role, bridging the gap between the former outsiders and the townspeople, sharing their own experiences of finding community after military service. But it wasn't just Big Mike's group that was changing. The people of Millbrook were opening up, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Eleanor's example had inspired others to speak about their experiences, whether it was fighting in more recent wars, overcoming personal tragedies, or battling illness. The town began organizing regular community dinners where these stories could be shared. It was at one of these dinners that Eleanor found herself sitting next to Tyler Maxwell, the young man who had once been her most vocal critic. "Mrs. Rigby," Tyler said, his voice low, "I wanted to thank you, not just for saving the town, but for showing us what real strength looks like. I thought being tough meant not backing down, but you showed me it's about having the courage to bring people together." Eleanor patted his hand gently. "We all have that courage in us, Tyler. Sometimes we just need a reminder." As the evening wore on, Eleanor looked around at the gathered townspeople, old-timers and newcomers, Silver Eagles and reformed bikers, all sharing a meal and conversation. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Millbrook had faced a threat and emerged stronger, not just by standing against an external force, but by opening itself to change and growth. The wounds of the past, Eleanor's long-buried memories, Big Mike's misguided quest, the town's complacency, were finally beginning to heal. As Eleanor made her way home that night, she realized that this sense of community, of belonging, of shared purpose, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. It was a legacy that would outlast any plaque or dedication, a living testament to the power of understanding, forgiveness, and unity. A year had passed since the day Eleanor Rigby stood up to a gang of bikers at her farm stand, setting in motion a series of events that would transform Millbrook forever. The town was preparing for the first annual Community Unity Festival, a celebration born from the trials and triumphs of the past year. Eleanor, now 91, sat on her porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and gold. Despite the early hour, the town was already buzzing with activity as people set up booths and decorations in the square that bore her name. Sarah Thompson pulled up on her motorcycle, now a familiar and welcome sight in Millbrook. "Ready for the big day?" she asked, joining Eleanor on the porch. Eleanor smiled. "As ready as I'll ever be, though I still think they're making too much fuss over an old woman." Sarah chuckled. "An old woman who saved the town, united former enemies, and inspired a whole community to rediscover its strength. Yeah, no reason to make a fuss at all." As they made their way into town, Eleanor marveled at the changes she saw. Big Mike and his gang, now respected members of the community, were helping to set up a stage for the day's events. The Silver Eagles, many of whom had become part-time. Residents of Millbrook were organizing a veterans support booth. The festival was in full swing by midday. Children laughed as they played games. The aroma of barbecue filled the air, and music drifted across the square. Eleanor found herself at the center of it all, receiving warm greetings and thanks from friends, old and new. As the sun began to set, Mayor Johnson took to the stage. "Folks, if I could have your attention, please. We have a special presentation to make." The crowd quieted as Eleanor was gently ushered to the stage. She stood there, feeling both embarrassed and deeply moved by the outpouring of affection from her community. "Eleanor Rigby," the mayor began, his voice carrying across the square, "a year ago, you showed us what it means to be a hero. Not just through your past deeds, which were remarkable in their own right, but through your unwavering commitment to this town and its people." He gestured to a covered object beside him. "We wanted to honor you in a way that would inspire future generations to follow your example." With a flourish, he pulled away the cover, revealing a beautiful bronze statue. It depicted Eleanor not as she was now, but as the young whack she had been during the war, standing tall and proud. But instead of a weapon, she held out her hand, as if offering help or welcome. Eleanor gasped, tears forming in her eyes. The mayor continued, This statue will stand here in Eleanor Rigby Square, a reminder of the courage, compassion, and community spirit that you embody. As the crowd erupted in applause, Eleanor felt overwhelmed. She looked out at the sea of faces, her neighbors, friends, and even former adversaries, all united in this moment of celebration. When the cheering subsided, Eleanor stepped up to the microphone. Her voice, though softened by age, carried the same strength and conviction it had when she first stood up to the bikers a year ago. "Thank you all," she began, "but this honor doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to all of us, to every person who stood up for what's right, who opened their hearts to former enemies, who worked to make our community stronger." She paused, looking at the statue of her younger self. "This statue, to me, represents not just who I was, but who we all can be. It's a reminder that in each of us lies the potential to be a hero, to make a difference, to build something beautiful, together." As Eleanor's words rang out across the square, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. Big Mike stood with his arm around one of the Silver Eagles, both men nodding in solemn agreement. Sarah Thompson smiled proudly, knowing that her faith in Eleanor and in Millbrook had been more than justified. The festival continued late into the night, a joyous celebration of a community that had faced adversity and emerged stronger, more united and more compassionate. As Eleanor finally made her way home, supported by Sarah and Officer Dan, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a long life, seen and done things both terrible and wonderful. But here, in her twilight years, she had found perhaps her greatest purpose, being a catalyst for change, a bridge between past and future, a beacon of hope for her beloved town. Eleanor Rigby, once a young woman who fought against tyranny in war-torn Europe, had become a different kind of hero. Her legacy would live on not just in bronze and stone, but in the hearts and actions of every person she had inspired. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Eleanor smiled. The little farm stand by the road had become so much more than she ever imagined. It had become the starting point of a journey that transformed not just her life, but the lives of an entire community. And in that transformation, Eleanor Rigby had found the greatest victory of all, the power of unity, understanding, and unwavering spirit to overcome any obstacle.